Hello everyone. I'm starting a series on block printing techniques, so I'll be moving from basic to more advanced techniques throughout the series. And if you're totally new to block printing, I think the best place to start is stamp making. So block prints are traditionally carved into wood, but stamp making can teach you a lot of the same concepts at a fraction of the cost and with minimal effort. So I'll just start by going into the supplies here. One good thing about stamp making is that it's extremely affordable, so you can get everything here for about $20 to $30. So the stamps are actually made from basically just this pink rubber. It's made by Speedball. It's called Speedy Carve. You can get that from a few different places too. There's also Blick makes its own, which is called Ready Cut, and Speedball also makes another cheaper version, which you can see is a little bit crumbly, called Speedy Cut. But out of the three, I definitely prefer Speedy Carve. It just cuts a little more cleanly and you can get more detail. It's like a good balance of easy cutting without being too brittle or rubbery. And then we will be carving into that using a lino cutting tool. So this is basically just a carving tool that has several different tips on it, and when you buy it, it comes with all of them, so it's really easy to get set up. You basically have everything you need, and it's convenient because they all store in here, so you're not going to stab yourself carrying this thing around. Pour them all out, and you've got a bunch of different blades ranging from larger U-shaped gouges to smaller V-shaped gouges for detail, plus a cutting blade for getting very fine edges. So that is our cutting tool. We will be printing onto Strathmore printmaking paper. It's just a lightweight, cheap paper for printmaking. You get good detail with it, but it's affordable enough that you can experiment and not worry about wasting paper. And for the stamp pad, we're going to be using Ranger Archival Ink stamp pads. They're acid-free, permanent, and waterproof, so it's pretty nice. They're never going to fade. And this is a tool that you don't need, but it's definitely helpful. This is called a Baren. This one's just a handmade one, made out of a little piece of wood wrapped in chamois cloth with a handle attached to it, but you can buy these pre-made as well. And then just a Sharpie for sketching up our image. So yeah, all of that you can get for about $20 to $30. There are more expensive things you can get, and you can definitely get a little more in-depth, like with different color ink pads, better cutting tools, better paper, all of that. But if you're just introducing yourself to the concepts, just start cheap. So the first step in this project is just creating your image. And with all forms of printmaking, you'll find that careful planning really pays off. Because it can be difficult or sometimes even impossible to correct mistakes. So always try to have at least a plan in mind when you're starting a block print. It'll save you a lot of headache later on. And so basic block prints are really just black and white images, like full contrast images. So they're very graphic, and like you're not going to get a lot of gradients with really any gradients with working with a stamp, at least. So a great way to sketch up your image is just using a Sharpie, because it's going to give you a very real idea of what your image will look like. So we're just going to start with a very basic design on this one. So just a lightning bolt. And keep in mind that if you're wanting to do something like lettering or anything that is specifically one direction, keep in mind that when you print a stamp or a block print, it's always going to be the mirror image. So just keep that in mind, that you're going to have to do the letters backwards. So we'll just start with this. So we have the lightning bolt. Just kind of remind ourselves that's going to be all the black area. Very basic. So we have our image sketched up. So the area here, that's going to be what we'll print as black, and this is going to be where the paper will show through. so that's going to be white. And with block printing, basically whatever you carve away will be white, or whatever the surface you're working on, that is going to be, wherever you carve away, that's what will show through, is the surface underneath. So anything you leave uncarved will be the color of your ink. Alright, so now we're going to be carving out our block. And first things first, with carving, you want to definitely be safe with how you're handling your tools, because these are basically just knives. You don't want to stab yourself doing this. So when you start carving, always try and keep your hand back here. So when you're holding down your block to keep it stable, always try and keep it behind your knife, and always carve away from yourself. So don't carve at yourself. Don't try and hold it like this and carve into your fingers. Always try and keep your hand away from where you're carving into the block, and always carve away from yourself, because you can get some pretty bad cuts if you put a gouge into your finger. So with this image, we're going to be cutting along this line here. So with like blocked images that have very straight lines, it's helpful to start by defining the edges using the knife tool. So this knife tool will just basically work similar to an X-Acto knife, basically just defining these edges along here. We'll press into it, and this stuff, the rubber carves like butter, so it's very easy to work with. Just press in and pull it to the top. Down here, do the same. And don't try and rush when you're cutting. Just take your time, pull a smooth line. And this stuff is pretty thick also, so you can carve pretty deeply, and you'll a lot of the times get more clean, better print if you're carving pretty deeply. So we've defined those lines here, so you can see carved through there, and that's just going to give us a clean edge rather than trying to create that with a gouge. It's nice to have the knife define the hard edges. So now we will be using the U-gouge, the larger U-gouge, to kind of block out all of the white color. So carving toward that line that we just created, we're just going to start in the middle there, middle of the lightning bolt, and carve to the edge. You can kind of pull off these strands if they don't come off on their own, which with the rubber they generally don't. There's always something kind of holding them there. Carve to that edge, and you can see, so there's a straight line from our first step right there, and we're just carving right into that. So do that across all of the lines. Alright. So when you're carving like this, when you're carving to that line, you'll see that sometimes ridges are created along here. So you can do that, like take care of that problem, because those ridges will sometimes print when you don't want them to. You can carve through like this and get rid of them, just like we did before, but kind of cutting between each cut. Or you can run your tool this way along it and knock out all of the ridges in one go. And try not to cut right to the edge here, because you've defined it with the other tool. You don't want to make it all wobbly by cutting along here, so try and cut just inward of that line. So with some images, this one for example, you're going to have these corners that, using that technique, it's not always the easiest to get like a very clean corner. So what we're going to be using to get those is just the V-gouge. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a V-shape knife. So we will be going from the corner, because we don't want to carve like into the corner like that, because you're potentially going to get like an X, or you might push further than you wanted to, and it'll just look kind of wonky. So it's nice to start at the corner and carve away from it. That way you're going to only go exactly to the point you want to. So push into there, carve out that corner. And kind of go from both ends. There we go. And then with this one, start at that corner and try and line it up as best you can with the line we created before. And start at that corner. There you go. Now I've got those corners made. And we have, so I wanted to show a couple techniques. So we did the straight line along there on those edges. On these other edges, I'm going to do some line work. Basically like straight lines working in to the lightning bolt to create a kind of shading. So we'll be using actually the V-gouge for this as well. And starting along here, we'll be cutting into the bulk of the shape. And breaking up the lines somewhat so they're not touching, they're just about a line widths apart from each other. And that way you'll get the illusion of a gradient. Alright, so our block is all cut, and so the next step is going to be printing it. And with this style, what makes this such an easy approach to block printing is that from this point on it's pretty much just like using a stamp. So there's not a whole lot of crazy technique that goes into this, where there can be if you're doing like a woodcut or something like that. There's a lot more practice that you need to put in. But with this, we're basically just stamping it. And I've got my paper here. It's the Strathmore paper, just cut into quarters. Got that in my block, and then here is the ink pad. So we're just gonna press into there, and this is where the Baren comes in handy. It comes in handy basically just getting even pressure on here so that you're not like just pressing down with your fingers. Get even pressure there, pick it up, and it looks like we could still use a little more. So about there, maybe some more in the center. Now for lining up your block onto your paper, there are some more advanced techniques that in later videos I'll go over with you exactly how to get a perfect registration, which is just another word for lining it up correctly. But for a small print like this, kind of the easiest way is just to eyeball it, especially with stamps. It's just easy to eyeball it. And I'm actually working on a grid right here. This cutting table has inch grids across it, which for me kind of helps as a visual aid to center my paper on that grid and then use that as a way to line up the block. So you just lay it down evenly, try and keep it totally still. You don't want to blend the edges or anything. And then distributing even pressure across the whole thing. And I always like to keep my other hand kind of holding whatever part I'm not pushing down, just to keep the block from slipping when you're applying the pressure. Now, lift it up evenly, and there's our print. So with stamps and block printing, you can print these as many times as you want. Once you kind of get in a rhythm of getting very consistent prints that all look fairly identical, you can do what's called additioning. And this is kind of one of the things that makes a print more valuable. So with printmaking, and additioning, you're kind of making a guarantee that you're not going to print any more by writing in the corner how many you've printed and then what number of that addition this particular print is. And then you would sign it. And in that way, you're kind of making a guarantee for your potential future buyers that I'm not going to print this again. There's only so many printed. Here's the number. Here's the one that this is. And that just adds a value to your work and is kind of just a traditional way for printmakers to catalog their work. So I'm just doing 3 of these, and do 1 out of 3 there, sign it, and if you want you can put a title in the middle, but there is the print. So it's a pretty basic print, but just to basically show you the techniques. Thank you for following along in my stamp making video. I will be releasing next a video on multiple colored prints, also done with stamps. I'm going to wait a little bit until we move into woodcuts, but still just using the basic stamping techniques, but I'll just go a little more in depth on how to get some more interesting techniques and really make the most out of your stamps.